Good afternoon. We're so pleased you're joining us. My name is Marielle Villeray, Program Development Director for the Office of Academic Initiatives and Strategic Innovation here at the Graduate Center. We're happy to continue this spring with the Underscored series of virtual performances, paired with conversations between musicians from the Copland House Ensemble and the Graduate Center doctoral program in music. We're using the Zoom webinar platform today and the Q&A tool found in the lower panel of your Zoom window for the live talkback. You can submit questions at any time throughout the program. I'm pleased to welcome Michael Boriskin from Copland House to tell you more about the music.
I'm Michael Boriskin, the Artistic and Executive Director of Copland House, and I'm so glad to welcome you to a new round of programs in our virtual series called Copland House Underscored. Today, we're going to be spotlighting, underscoring, a really stellar piece that Copland House had the pleasure of commissioning 10 years ago. And in that decade, this wonderful piece has been widely acclaimed and performed extensively around the United States. Many of those performances were by our own music from Copland House Ensemble, and we have also had the honor of recording the piece as well. The piece is called Crossings. It was written in 2011 by today's featured composer, Pierre Jalbert. Pierre has been acknowledged by no less than the New Yorker magazine as an acknowledged chamber music master. He has won awards all over the world, including the BBC Master Prize, the Rome Prize, the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center's Stoger Prize, which recognizes chamber music excellence, and an award or two by the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Copland House is proud to have had an over 20-year long relationship with him. Pierre has twice been a Copland House resident, and I'm so glad to have the opportunity to welcome him today and talk with him a bit about this terrific piece before we hear a complete performance of it. So Pierre, let's start literally at the top of the piece with the title, Crossings. The piece is fairly abstract. I mean, there's no real tonal painting or sound painting, as we call it, in the piece. It doesn't seem to try to evoke pictorial imagery. It doesn't make any literary or extra musical references, but the title Crossings does seem to be pregnant with some kind of meaning or other. So tell us a bit, first of all, how you landed on the title Crossings and what that is to suggest.
Well, the title really came from, thinking about my own family ancestry and uh, crossing of an ocean or crossing borders. Um, but, it could refer to any kind of uh, journey of wandering peoples into, strange lands and what that is like. Like you said, the piece is not programmatic, but to me, it's more about sort of states of being. Um, what did it feel like, to there's certainly hope in sometimes in crossings. There's sometimes terrifying, it can be terrifying to go to someplace new and start a new life. But the whole piece was based on this French Canadian folk song, which I was trying to find something that would sort of represent um, my own family ancestry, and was doing all this listening to lots of different types of folk songs. Um, and so I found this kind of uh, very wistful, melancholy, simple tune that you actually don't hear until the middle of the piece.
Let
But
me
everything you hear is sort of based on that.
exactly. And even though we don't hear the piece, the folk song, in full and purely set out until the middle of the piece, I thought since we're talking about it, I should play it now. So let's hear it. Let's hear this folk song right now.
Yeah, it has a kind of simple melancholy to it, I think. The title of the folk song is actually Quand, parti du Canada, when I left Canada. And it's about a journey from Canada to the US, which again represents sort of my own family history. But I was also thinking way back of, crossing the ocean to get from Europe to Canada, and again, thinking in general about anyone's journey, crossing oceans, crossing borders,
So
and what that's like.
the song real itself really encapsulates the idea of the piece. Yes.
Absolutely. And you hear from the beginning, though it's in a very different context, little fragments of the melody. So my goal was sort of to uh, not just arrange a folk tune, but to really integrate it into my own contemporary musical language and sort of, um, you know, make it into something else.
So which came first? And maybe this is a dangerous question, but did did you have this idea of the piece, this sort of searching, migrating amongst different lands, and the musical analog for that? Did you have that notion first, and were kind of looking for a key into that, so to speak, or did your finding the folk song sort of steer you in that direction?
I think I was looking for something that would fit in with this idea because I sort of knew the the framework for the piece that I wanted, but I didn't have the detail yet. And so this, I mean, there are some other tunes too I could have used, but this one seemed to uh, encapsulate that idea and could go in all sorts of different directions. And in fact, there are, while some of the music, especially at the beginning, sounds, more, how do I put it, more like concert music, contemporary concert music. Other sections sound kind of like French Canadian folk fiddling, and there's kind of a section like that as well. So
Yes.
all these mixtures of ideas, I wanted to sort of mix together and see what happened.
Well, it's, I mean, the just the shape of the piece is as you were suggesting is really interesting because it is in three large sections, and one begins with a very big and bold, dramatic, high energy um, announcement of the piece, and the whole first big section is charging ahead full full blast, and then everything seems to clear way for the tune, and we have this totally contrasting serene middle section, and then the first section kind of comes back in many places literally. We hear the same music again, but isn't it true that basically everything we hear, almost everything we hear in the piece, is somehow drawn from this simple folk tune. I mean, you have, as you started to say before, fragments of it. The tune is deconstructed and rearranged and transformed. Isn't that so?
Yeah, and so the idea was that you would hear, at least at the beginning, you would hear these fragments that make a certain surface kind of sound, a certain contemporary kind of sound. But then, like you said, it gradually clears away, and you're left with this simplicity uh, of this folk tune, which I just love.
Exactly. Well, listen, let's hear the piece now. This is a full, complete performance of the piece. It's a pre-COVID, maskless performance of the piece by music from Copland House. The performers are flutist Linda Chessis, clarinetist Derek Bermel, violinist Harumi Rhodes, cellist Alexis Pia Gerlach, and me as pianist. Please don't leave after the end of the piece. Join us for a live Q&A. We will be back. Pierre and I will be back to answer all of your questions. You can type your questions in by using this nifty chat button or Q&A button at the bottom center of your screen. We look forward to taking all of your questions. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the performance now. Okay, well, we are back, and thank you all for joining us, those of you who are with us. Before we get into your questions, and I'm just setting up my screen here for that. Before we get into your questions, just a couple of housekeeping um, bits of housekeeping. If you would please, those of you who have questions, and we hope you've been thinking them all up during the performance, please use the chat button at the bottom center of your screen and send in your questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. The other thing to mention is that this performance is being recorded. The Graduate Center will post this on its YouTube channel. So for those of you who would love to see it again, it will be up shortly, and please tell all your friends to check it out as well. Crossings is a wonderful piece, as you all heard, and we're always thrilled to be able to perform it. A couple of other quick pieces of housekeeping. The Graduate Center will be sending out a very brief survey about your thoughts and comments about this program. This is a relatively new series, but we will be programming this virtual series throughout most, if not all, of 2021 in our COVID world. And so your comments will certainly help guide us as we continue to shape these programs. Speaking of which, the next program is coming up on February 22nd, and we have scheduled all of the programs through 2021 on the fourth Monday of every month, except for the last program at the end of the year. February 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, we will have the pleasure and honor of featuring the virtual premiere of a fabulous new piece that the Graduate Center's own Professor John Musto, an Emmy award-winning and wonderful, wonderful composer, has written for us a cello sonata for cello and piano. That's February 22nd at 1 p.m. So without further ado, I see that there's a bunch of questions in the queue here. And as soon as I find them, here we are. Someone called this a bit of midday medicine for me. Thank you. I hope it was tasty and healthful medicine for you. Thank you for joining us. So there's a question here from Alden, and he asks, how much of the folk tune melody survives in your piece? This is a multi-part question. How did you pace the bits that you used over the duration of the work? And by the way, it's a beautiful piece, and I enjoyed it very much. So Pierre, take it away. How much of the melody survives, and how did you pace it throughout the piece?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first of all, let me just say that was a great performance by
Thank you.
from Copland House. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you
for that. So how much of the melody survives? Well, you get the whole thing pretty much. It's basically the refrain, no verses of the original folk tune in the middle of the piece, stated quite simply over these long drones in the winds. The rest of the piece is very fragmented in terms of what you hear in the melody. It could just be a few notes here and there. So it's presented in much different kinds of textures. Like at the very beginning with this sort of bold and dramatic music, again with these open fits, which always remind me of folk music, you know, this kind of interval, presented in a very kind of different way. But in a way, I don't know if you've ever heard, there's some pieces that theme and variations, you know, where you have a theme at the beginning and then the variations get more and more complicated as you move forward. And some modern composers have taken that and sort of thrown it backwards, and you get the most complicated at first and it winds its way down to the original theme. That sort of in a way is what happens here, not for the whole piece, but at least for a good half of it. It's not a sort of regimented variation form or anything, but it's the kind of thing that happens is it just gets, you get pulled into this theme that's becomes clearer and clearer until you get the full thing in the middle. And then after that, you have sort of repetition and reminders of the various kinds of materials that came before.
That's exactly right. It seems to me that you hear almost every part, every element of the theme before you get to it, from the beginning to the middle, when we finally hear the theme by itself. It's very fragmented. Often, sometimes you hear little bits of it, and the character is completely changed as well, almost to the point where it's disguised. So if the tune sort of starts out yum ba yadadum, and it's very lyrical and sort of a bit mysterious and doleful, I think you said at one point, but at the beginning of the piece, which is so rhythmic and so driving, you hear yum bum ba dum da da dum, right? And it's the theme, but it's totally disguised, right?
Yeah, it's a totally different character. And if you don't quite hear it, you know, if you don't quite get that, that's totally fine. It's just meant to be a certain kind of impact, a kind of texture that sort of leaps out at you. And it's almost like, in a way, it's you know, I always say chaos, and then it's not chaos. It's very strictly written out musically, but in a way, it's more. It's sort of this dynamic, almost chaotic kind of bubbling that resolves itself out eventually.
And it's to be sure, and thank you for qualifying and clarifying that it's a controlled chaos, right? There's a big difference creatively and probably in most other aspects of life between something that's meant to seem chaotic and wild as opposed to something that actually is, right?
Yeah. No,
So we've got a bunch of other questions coming in from Leonard. The folk tune's quiet and beautiful appearance in the middle section reminds me of the appearance of the Shaker song "Simple Gifts" in Appalachian Spring by Aaron Copland. Were you mindful of this when you wrote Crossings?
that's a great question. I wasn't conscious of that particularly, but now that you bring it up, I mean, Copland was obviously a huge influence for me growing up, and I'm sure that somehow was in the back of my mind. But yeah, that's a beautiful example of how something like that can be used. Sure.
Yeah, and how can one not be have in the back of one's mind, you know, such an emblematic piece as Appalachian Spring? I was actually reading that and we talked a little bit about this in the Q&A beforehand today. Copland had the basic idea of the piece of Appalachian Spring in mind, but was looking for some kind of a key that would sort of encapsulate the piece. and he sort of somewhat accidentally came across Simple Gifts in a book of Shaker folk songs, which had only recently been published at that point in the 1940s. And you were saying a bit, if I remember correctly and understood you correctly, that this folk tune sort of was performed a little bit the same function, that it was sort of the key to sort of the larger structure of the piece. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, before, because so much of the piece is based on this, this was the first thing I found. So I didn't start writing the piece and then say, oh, I want to put a folk tune in the middle. It was really more finding that tune and seeing what it might suggest, what I could do with it, and how I could sort of do it both ways. Present it as a simple, because it didn't need any elaboration really when it appears there in the middle. What I could do to present it there, but also to incorporate it into my own contemporary musical language and have that sort of conversation within the piece.
Well, since the whole piece, as we were just saying, the whole piece is derived from the folk song, and it's fragmented and deconstructed and reordered, you kind of needed to have the folk song to start with before you could even write the piece. There's a question here, and this is a really interesting question from Iris. And I think it's maybe also one of those dangerous questions as well. Iris said she heard our world premiere of this piece 10 years ago on Copland House's main stage series in Westchester, and you were there. Again, I say with great pride that we commissioned this piece, and we're thrilled that we did, and that we had a little bit of a role in making this, in bringing this piece into existence. So she said that she heard the premiere 10 years ago, which was wonderful. And if you were writing the piece now, in today's world, how different do you think it would be? Go for it, Pierre.
Oh, it's hard to say. That's a great question. One could return to just about any piece and they would probably do something different because you're at a different point in your life. I think it was you can correct me, Michael. I think it was Copland said that composers don't simply end pieces, they abandon them. Because we always want to go back and fix stuff, or change things and edit things.
Yeah.
But I think it probably would be different. This was 10 years ago. I'm not sure what would be different, but knowing everything that's gone on in the past 10 years, I'm sure that would affect how I would approach the piece. But that, to me, raises another interesting point, and maybe I'll ask you, Michael. You guys premiered this piece 10 years ago, and now that you've played it over the course of that time, how has it changed for the group and for you?
Well, that's a great question, and it's the other side of the question that Iris asked about, what would you do different? In a certain sense, the answer is maybe almost everything, because we're different people. I mean, even if the world hadn't changed, you're a different person. And we as performers are different people. That's one of the great frustrations about recording something. Performers have felt this way over the generations. I remember Arthur Rubinstein, the great pianist, saying, this was one of the problems with recordings, is that you make the recording and then, you come back to it 5 years later and you've changed, but the recording hasn't. These things are snapshots I would say, of who we are at particular points in time and particular points in our lives. You know, one of the exciting things as a performer is to learn a piece that has never been performed before, that's brand new, that we create the performing tradition. And there are so many nuts and bolts involved in learning a piece of music. I mean, every aspect of it is totally unfamiliar. It's not as if we were to sit down and, you know, decide that we might be playing for the first time Maurice Ravel's great piano trio, because we've heard so many performances of it. It's in our ears, it's in our DNA at this point. The piece is over 100 years old, and there's a tradition surrounding it. So we come to it and we want to create our own performance, and we want to have our own understanding about the piece. But, you know, we come to it from a different place than picking up and opening up for the first time a new piece called Crossings by a composer named Pierre Jalbert wasn't in existence even a week ago. And we're starting really from scratch. And I would say that with your piece, we go through the same process. We play it once and then twice and then 5 times and 10 times. And the more we play it, the more it becomes a part of us. And so we're not, you know, we get away from thinking of the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of it. And we start thinking of it and feeling it like, you know, a real musical experience. It becomes ours. Sorry, Pierre, it's got your name on it, but it's our piece at this point when we play it. So I hope, you know, it's hard to put that into words, but I hope that that conveys, I mean, the piece becomes really a part of us. And I think one of the goals for any performer is to assimilate, to digest and assimilate the piece so much that, you know, we can't be separated from it. We can't be separated from either the piece or the performer. But that's a wonderful question.
And that's a privilege for the composer to be able to, because I've seen this piece evolve with you guys and you've made it your own, and that's what a composer loves to see. I mean, for the piece to have a life and to see it evolve in the performer's hands. So it's
Thank you.
A great privilege. Yeah.
And our hope is that as it evolves, it still coincides with something that you had in mind when you wrote it, that it still sounds vaguely familiar to you. So there's a few more questions here from Edward. How did the piece change? How did the piece change during the course of the first rehearsal? Terrific piece, terrific performance. Thank you. Well, thank you, Edward. How did it change during the course of the first rehearsal? I guess I should take that because we didn't let you hear it at the first rehearsal.
Yeah, composers aren't invited to the first rehearsal.
I have to say, and I don't mean this to sound overly congratulatory to our very good friend Pierre here. But, you know, Pierre is the kind of composer who is so careful is not the right word, is so meticulous and has such an extraordinary sense of what he wants that what he puts on paper, I mean, that's our roadmap. I mean, there are a lot of composers, and it doesn't particularly have to do with whether they're a good composer or a bad composer, it has to do with their process. And there are all kinds of composers and artists of all kinds who are constantly changing and revising, literally down to the world premiere and even after the world premiere. the piece sort of keeps on evolving and keeps on getting shaped. I mean, Pierre really has such a good sense of what he has in mind and is so well trained, so well grounded as a composer that he can convey that in the black and white of a piece of music. And we've played a lot of pieces by Pierre's, and we've done a recording of 4 of Pierre's really great chamber music, chamber works. You can buy that recording, by the way, on the Copland House website, if I may. We've had this experience multiple times with Pierre, that if we do what he has written on the page, we've got it. And, there might still be some subtle changes along the way, but it's very clear. Pierre sets out very clearly and cleanly what he wants from a piece of music. And the only way that I would say that the piece changed over the course of the first rehearsal is that it allowed us to hear all the parts together for the first time. And we really started to put it together. And our challenge was really just to shape and finish our performance of it. And, Pierre, as all good composers, I mean, they had wonderful suggestions when we finally did get together, which was probably after the second or third rehearsal. But this wasn't the kind of piece where, gosh, this had to be, we had to overhaul completely how we were performing it. And at the rehearsal, or Pierre had to completely rewrite sections because it didn't sound what he had in mind. I think it's fair to say that you knew what it was going to sound like in your head. Hopefully, when you first heard it at our rehearsal, it didn't disappoint you in terms of what the piece came out sounding like. Is that so? I hope.
Yeah, I mean, part of that whole rehearsal process, it's kind of like you take the 10-year process and try to see what can happen in just a few rehearsals. And, with performers like this who are incredible, the learning curve is just huge. They just pick up stuff so fast. But it's a question of everybody sort of working together towards the same goal. And sometimes they had questions for me, what exactly I wanted, what kind of character, if it wasn't clear. So that's always useful in the rehearsal process.
For sure. Last question. Time flies. And maybe just 30 seconds. A question from Judy. Going back to Copland, it seems, she heard a bit of Copland-like tonality. Is that true?
Well, I consider my music, there are certainly tonal aspects to my music, and the whole piece, begins and ends is rooted in D. It's not D major or D minor. It's just a tonal center of around those pitches. And there are
Which comes from the folk song.
Which comes from, exactly, the folk song is pitched in D too. So, although it has a mixture of both major and minor.
Exactly. I was just going to say,
all these things. That's what I loved about that folk tune as well. But there are atonal elements in there too, which and I think that the mixture of those things and the contrast of those things are part of my musical language that makes music what I love to do, by approaching it in different ways.
Well, it certainly sounds it, and it certainly comes through in your music, which is really just brimming with life and energy. It's always a treat to work with you. You and we have had a over 20-year relationship at this point, and with Copland House. And we look forward to continuing that. We thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. And again, a reminder that our next program in our series, Copland House Underscored, is on the fourth Monday of February, which is February 22nd, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Or is it Eastern Daylight? I get confused, but it's 1 p.m. in New York, and you guys figure it out wherever you may be. But please join us. John Musto's new sonata for cello and piano is what we will be doing. One last question has come in, which has given me the opportunity to it was a question about how to buy the recording. It gives me the opportunity to say again that the recording is available on the Copland House website, which is www.coplandhouse.org, and go up at the top to the bar that says shop, and you will find it there. We'd love for you to buy it, and please join us again on February 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for John Musto's Sonata for Cello and Piano. Pierre, thank you all. Great pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.